Okay, thank you for coming. This is indeed our last installation for our Global Media Industry Speaker Series for Spring 2018. You will hear from us in the fall again. And the speaker series is made possible by the Academic Enrichment Fund from the Graduate School, the Department of Radio, TV, and Film, and the support from many faculty, staff, and students. In fact, today's talk was scheduled quite a few months ago, back in September, October 2017. Who knows, just in a few months, U.S.-China relation has become so intensive, sensitive, and divided. And in both countries, there are many different voices and narratives. And of course, media, what we study here at the Moody College, play a very important role. Our speaker today, David Frenchten, is the founding director of the University of Texas at Austin's China Public Policy Center. And David is also a clinical professor at UT's LBJ School of Public Affairs. David had a long, decorated career as a U.S. diplomat and worked many years in think tanks in Washington, D.C. He is specialized in China and U.S.-China relation. David is the author or co-author of 3 books, including 2 bestsellers published in China and in Chinese. And I don't think anyone in the room has that achievement yet. And today, David will talk about Sharp China. David.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, Wenhong, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Can you hear me at the back okay at this level? Okay, if so, then I think I'll not need the handheld mic. Wenhong, I'm really grateful for the kind introduction, the kind invitation. It's really an honor for me to be here with all of you, and I'm grateful to all of you for the precious gift of your time this afternoon. I am currently at the university, as Wenhong mentioned. I'm also an alumnus of the University of Texas, the LBJ School and the Center for Asian Studies, as it was called at that time, and in fact, I think I was the first student that went into the joint LBJ Asian Studies Master's program quite some years ago. So it's a particular honor to be back at this extraordinary university and to have this opportunity today to be here at one of the world-leading schools of communication, colleges of communication that I'm such a big admirer of. On a personal note, my dad got a degree from this communication school, I think before it was called the Moody College. And so we have deep family ties to this university and to your wonderful school and your wonderful college. The topic today, I think, is very resonant, and I want to, in a minute, share a little bit about sort of what I want to do in this talk. I want to try to accomplish a lot in about 55 or 60 minutes. There is a risk that I'll go 75 minutes, but I hope that my good friend Wenhong will cue me at about the 55-minute mark so that we can leave ample time for any of your questions and comments, which I know I always find to be enormously valuable in these types of sessions. Before that, let me just say a couple of words about the newly created or still fairly new China Public Policy Center at the LBJ School here at the University of Texas. We started in late August of last year with the beginning of the academic year. We're about 7 months into our existence. Things are going really well. I continue to be enormously grateful to President Greg Fenves and LBJ School Dean Angela Evans for their extraordinary leadership and visionary leadership, and for believing in this idea and helping make it a reality for the university. We are an interesting entity that is kind of a hybrid and perhaps a little different from the traditional academic center model. We do basically 4 distinct things. One, We serve as an academic unit here on this campus. In that sense, that's a normal function of any center. We want to support students, educate students, mentor students, help students, be a resource, help our faculty be a platform for the presentation of really compelling thought leadership, and so on. So that is one element of what we do. We're also a think tank on China and policy. Basically, if it has to do with China and has to do with policy, it's within our mandate. So whether that's foreign policy, domestic policy, we want to be an operation that puts forward compelling ideas that make the world a better place in some tangible way. The third thing we do is Track 2 diplomacy, which is a kind of back-channel, informal citizen-to-citizen diplomacy, not official by definition, but that has official connectivity, and where folks in power, for example, in Washington and in Beijing, care a lot about what we do and sometimes ask us to do some things that's harder for governments to do. So the Track 2 diplomacy piece is important. And finally, we want to be a very powerful connector between Texas and China in the economic sphere and in the business, investment, and trade sphere, and also more broadly the U.S. and China as well. So the trade investment piece of what we do is really important. I welcome all of you to get involved in the work of our center. If any of you are interested in getting involved with us, being involved in our events, coming by and visiting with me to learn more, I warmly welcome that and look forward to that. Now, let me just share kind of a map of what I'd like to talk about today. I think it's a very resonant topic. The title I gave it was Sharp, in quotes, Sharp China, question mark, or in my mind there's a question mark. The current U.S.-China narrative, the current American narrative about China, and why it's bad for America. So this is a topic that I think is probably on the minds of many in this room from the standpoint of your study of communications. It's certainly a topic that's been on my mind, and it's one that I think is very resonant relative to the broader issue of U.S.-China relations, which I think many of us care about and should care about. So number one, I want to share a few observations just about the current state of the U.S. narrative about China and the U.S. framing of China. And here, I want to disproportionately focus on the media narrative and the media framing, but it also spills into the political world. And there's obviously a dynamic interaction between media framing on the one hand and political discourse on the other in both directions. But I will talk quite a bit about the media and hence the opportunity to be a part of the Global Media Industries Speaker Series. Second thing I want to talk about is the notion of soft versus so-called sharp power. I'll say a few words about that. It's sort of built into the title. It's a term that's been coined recently by others, fairly new term that dates back to December. And I want to talk a little bit about what sharp power means and how it ostensibly differs from soft power. The third thing I want to share, and this is kind of the heart and soul of what I want to talk about, are my thoughts on why a reflexive and ideologically driven negative narrative on China is bad for America. And I think there are probably about 6 or 7 reasons why it's bad for our country. And I want to share those because I have some concern about the direction that the narrative in this country is going with respect to China. Not because it's bad for China, but because it's bad for us. And then fourth, I'll share a few concluding thoughts. So those are the 4 things that I want to do. When we break for breakfast tomorrow morning, we can then go into the Q&A. No, but Wenhong is going to try to keep me on track in terms of time. So let me just start by talking about the current framing of China in the U.S. media and in U.S. political discourse, and as I mentioned, the dynamism between the two. I think the tonality in this country, in particular in the media, about China has gotten a lot more negative than it's ever been. Now let's recognize, since 1989, generally coverage of China in the United States has not exactly been fawning. I think all of us understand that. And that was a real milestone in the U.S.-China relationship that particular year. But since that time, there's been some level of negativity, but it's sort of been within a certain bandwidth. I think we have seen in the last 6 months, for reasons that I'll touch on in a little bit, a sharp change and deterioration in the tonality around China that puts us into a qualitatively different period today when it comes to talking about how we talk about China than we have ever been in the modern era, in my opinion. Let me give you a few examples of some of the storylines or themes that we've seen over the last 6 months or so around China in the U.S. media, and a lot of this, again, has spilled into U.S. political discourse, which we'll talk a little bit about as well, necessarily. And I'll kind of go in sort of reverse chronological order, starting with a big story that that has been in the news just over the past several days that many of you may be aware of, around the issue of Confucius Institutes and the fact that a couple of Central Texas members of Congress wrote a letter, kind of an open letter to university leaders across the states, and in particular those universities that, unlike the University of Texas, have Confucius Institutes, basically calling upon those universities to cease and desist having any relationship with Confucius Institutes going forward. Now, obviously, this is not a binding request. It's a letter from 2 members of Congress, one Republican, one Democrat. But it obviously gets people's attention when 2 members of Congress from your home state delegation write such a letter. The members of Congress stated that in writing in their letter that they believe that Confucius Institutes represent, quote, a national security threat to the United States. And I could quote their letter at length, but the language was very, very strong. And they asked, if you will, respectfully but quite firmly requested that university presidents cease and desist. They also did one other thing that was not widely reported in the media stories in the Austin American-Statesman, San Antonio Express, and the other papers, the Dallas Morning News and others that covered this. And at the end of their letter, they actually said, basically, therefore, we again ask you to cease and desist on Confucius Institutes, but also, in their words, we ask you as university leaders to prevent cooperation with any organization or cooperative agreements with any organization that is supported by the Chinese government. Now, that's actually a very sweeping statement when you think about it. And just to put it in perspective without really editorializing about it at this juncture in my talk, let me just point out, if one were to take that directive at face value and adhere to it to the letter, every university agreement at a Texas university with any Chinese educational organization or university would have to be shredded to comply with that directive because, of course, every Chinese university is a government-supported and financed operation. This is the direction that our discourse is going, and this is a story that's been in the news this week, and it'll stay in the news for some time, I suspect. A couple of other examples. There was a big story, I think a very interesting and significant story in terms of framing of China in the United States, around the director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, and his testimony before Congress about, as he stated it, the threat posed to U.S. academia by Chinese students and Chinese scholars on the grounds of, as he characterized it, their propensity to commit the felony of espionage. So he spoke it's on the written record, Director Wray spoke in very sweeping terms about Chinese being a problem, whether that's students, whether it's scholars, whether it's visiting scholars, from a counterintelligence and espionage standpoint. The remarks were seen by many across this country as very controversial and provocative, and they were seen by many as very over the top. A number of members of Congress sharply rebuked the director of the FBI for making these sweeping ethnic-based or national origin-based generalizations about a group of hundreds of thousands of people. And the Committee of 100, a very distinguished group of Chinese American leaders in this country, made a similar rebuke, and others did as well. Here's another example of kind of what's happening in the overall narrative in this country. China is being portrayed as a threat. Chinese are being portrayed as a threat by none other, in this case, than the director of the FBI. In fact, the director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, stated that the FBI is now investigating or has launched, quote, investigations into issues relating to Confucius Institutes and other Chinese government-supported entities and their influence on the United States. Raises an interesting question. I won't dwell on it, but just to raise the question, The FBI is a law enforcement agency. As I understand it, it can only investigate issues where a violation of law has occurred or potentially occurred. If the issue is influence, then I'm not aware of any laws in the United States that prevent the endeavor of influencing someone's views, partly because we have this thing called the First Amendment. And so it'll be very interesting to see exactly what the FBI is investigating. But presumably, they're investigating espionage, because if it's only about influence, it's not clear to me that the FBI has jurisdiction to investigate matters that don't bump up against federal law. So that's out there. A third issue that was in the news in the early part of this year and dating back to last year was the kind of storyline around the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, CUSEF, or CUSEF as it's often referred to. And the idea in the media reporting around this, in a number of reports that came out last fall and that spilled into the early part of this year, is that the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, which is a foundation based in Hong Kong, funded by private sector Hong Kong interests, and chaired by a gentleman who also wears kind of an honorary hat as a vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a gentleman named C.H. Tung. The allegation was put forth, or the assertion was put forth in media reporting across a variety of publications, that this entity was really doing the bidding of China, doing the bidding of the Communist Party, working nefariously against the interests of the United States, seeking to co-opt U.S. discourse and turn it onto more friendly terms, seeking to influence U.S. elites, seeking to propagandize American students, and the list of its asserted sins goes on and on. So this was a storyline that obviously played out over a period of months and that many of you may well be aware of. Beyond that, there's been stories, and I won't dwell on these in as great a length because I want to come back to the three stories that I mentioned earlier just now as I talk about some specific examples of why I think these narratives are problematic for America. But beyond these storylines, there were a few others. There's a lot of reporting about how U.S. companies are being co-opted to serve China and to do China's bidding kind of politically in the United States. There's a number of stories about China's rise as a technological superpower, about its facility with artificial intelligence, about facial recognition advances in terms of China's ability to surveil its citizens, and basically kind of be a big brother state. There are stories about, and there have been quite a few stories in recent months, about American companies who have been chastised and rebuked by the Chinese authorities for misusing the term Taiwan in some of their websites. Some of us have seen those stories, and the fact that some U.S. companies have had to issue apologies for referring to Taiwan as a country on their websites or in their literature. And the list goes on. There's just been a huge amount of negativity about China, all in all, over these last several months. In my judgment, having worked on China for nearly 30 years professionally, it seems to me that we are at a high watermark of negativity about China in the U.S. media. And as I noted in terms of some of the comments made in the political world and in Washington, it's spilling over now into political discourse as well. The bottom line is that China is being portrayed as an omnipotent and unstoppable authoritarian juggernaut that is gunning for the United States. And that is the singular message that is the through line and the common theme that comes through so much of the reporting in this country. Now, while it's certainly true that China is, in my judgment, unquestionably the most formidable national competitor of the United States, and it will be for the next several decades, in my judgment, probably the judgment of many others, the fact is I think we see a very sharp tendency toward a kind of reflexive and ideologically driven narrative about China that is not always evidence-based. And I'll say more about that. The recent spate of highly confrontational, negative reporting about China has a number of interesting features that I just want to briefly share. And a couple of these points I'll dwell on, a couple of them I'll just skim over. But number one, it's all happening, I think, I perceive, in the wake of the 19th Party Congress, the Communist Party Congress that took place last fall in October in China. Very shortly after that Congress, which, if you will, re-elected or re-selected Mr. Xi Jinping for another 5-year term as General Secretary and so on, and in which he gave a 3.5-hour keynote address, which of course was quite rightly and understandably very carefully scrutinized. Shortly after that, this negativity, I think, saw the sharp uptick that I'm describing. So I think we're, in some ways, looking at a dynamic in which the coverage is responding to what is perceived to be an increasingly assertive and powerful China coming out of the 19th Congress. And some of the language that President Xi, General Secretary Xi in this context, used certainly gave rise to concerns on the part of many in the United States about China's intentions and aspirations. So that's one point. Perhaps the most significant, or an even more significant point that I think is worth noting, is that the sharp increase in negativity toward China that we're seeing in the media in the United States today is occurring at a time of relative economic high performance and strength on the part of the United States. So by American standards, in the last year or so, we've been growing at a better than average rate. Objectively, that's just the numbers. We have seen lower unemployment than we've seen in several generations. In fact, in some segments of the U.S. population, we are at historically low, record-setting levels of employment and record low levels of unemployment. We have had, up at least until January, a boom in the stock market like we've rarely seen. And even now, after all the hits in the stock market that have been taken in recent weeks, 6 or 7 weeks, we're still very close to the all-time high in all of history. So the fact is, the U.S. economy is chugging along quite nicely by the standards of the U.S. economy. And yet we see this incredible increase in negativity. I had earlier postulated, without having done all of the sort of scientific research, but some anecdotal probing, I had postulated that generally speaking, China looked a lot more fearsome to the United States when unemployment was at 10% than when unemployment was at 4%. What we're seeing now is that China looks most fearsome and omnipotent when our unemployment is around 4%. That is different than what we've seen in modern American history. So that's interesting. Third point I would make is that the coverage that we're seeing is occurring against the backdrop of some really interesting new dynamics in the American media and in American life that you know, many of you know better than I do. And it's the notion of fake news and the wonderful notion of alternative facts. And what we've seen in the United States, and I would argue probably to some degree on both sides of the partisan aisle, net, but maybe more on one side than the other, there has been a tendency, I believe, and I think many believe, away from fact-based or evidence-based argumentation. We've seen some pretty striking and stunning examples of that in this country in the last year and a half, couple of years, et cetera, and certainly in the last several months. And it seems to me, from my reading of some of the reporting on China, that has been very sharply negative and very reflexively negative, that notion of the de-emphasis of facts, the de-emphasis of evidence, the de-emphasis of factual accuracy, which we see prevalently in our society today and in our politics, has, in my judgment, sadly seeped into the media as well. Including, by the way, the liberal media, quote unquote, not just the, quote, conservative media. So I'll give a couple of examples of that later, but this notion of alternative facts, I think, is part of the soup that we've got surrounding all of the things that are happening on the China narrative. And then fourth point I would make is, that very closely relates to that point, is that I perceive that journalists are far less apologetic now, or let me put it this way, far less reticent than they were to simply advance a very particular argument and agenda that they think is the right argument. There was an article that came out around the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation storyline that occurred last fall and early this winter in which one journalist said, and I'm quoting fairly closely but not verbatim, "We have a duty to expose the Chinese for who they are and to expose China for what it's doing." And the journalist used the word expose. And that is an agenda. That's an unapologetic agenda. And I sense that there's more of that now, at least subjectively I perceive there's more of that now than I've seen in the past on China. Finally, and this segues into the next section, I think the narrative, and the media narrative in particular, has been disproportionately focused on China's, quote, influence operations in the United States. China's influence operation. That's the term that keeps coming up. And it has certain connotations. Operations almost has a military or intelligence connotation. These phrases are not utilized by accident. That's part of my argument. And what we hear is a lot of talk about China's perceived or real influence in the United States. Now, against that backdrop, let me go to the second point here and talk a little bit about soft power versus sharp power. As I noted, the focus in the U.S. media on China has been on China's ostensible efforts to influence U.S. discourse, to propagandize Americans, including students, and to insinuate itself into our discourse in ways that presumably take the terms of our discourse and make them more favorable to China. This phenomenon has been greeted with such alarm in the United States that a new lexicon has been literally created to simply describe China's efforts. And that's basically the construct of sharp power. The term sharp power is the title of a report that came out in December. So it's a very new term. The two authors of the report published by the National Endowment of Democracy, or NED, coined the term. It has gained resonance. It has been used mostly, not exclusively, but mostly in the China context, but also about Russia and others, but mostly about China. And they basically offer a definition in their report that in summary can be, that I quote as just 6 or 7 words kind of sum up their definition, which they describe in some greater detail. And that is, sharp power is, quote, the use of deceptive information for hostile purposes, unquote. Now, they also say a lot of other things, a lot of different explication about what they mean. But again, their term, the author's term, those who coined this term, their definition is the use of deceptive information for hostile purposes. They also talk about sharp power as being a type of power that, in their words, quote, pierces, punctures, and perforates the unquote, the information space or political process of a foreign country. And obviously they use those words very much to suggest sharpness. I see some problems with the construct of sharp power, and I'll share a few more editorial thoughts, my views, in a few minutes. But let me make one point for now, and that is that I think there's a pretty profound problem with the definition of the term as the authors themselves, the coiners of the term themselves, have put on the table. And that is that there are two very subjective words in their definition. One is deceptive, and the other is hostile. So what is deceptive? What may seem deceptive to one person may not seem deceptive to another. There may be things where everyone can agree that's deceptive. There may be any number of subjective areas of endeavor where one person may not see a characterization as deceptive while another does. And so you're defining a construct on the foundation of a highly subjective term. But even more subjective is the notion of hostility. What is hostile? What may seem hostile to me may not seem hostile to you, and vice versa. When the United States, for example, seeks to advance democracy and human rights, that feels good to us. That feels true to our values. It feels hostile to China. I'm not judging it one way or the other, but there's no question that it feels hostile to China. When they do certain things, they may perceive it as being things that are natural for them to do in their interests, etc. We may perceive it as hostile. So you have a construct called sharp power in which the very definition hinges upon some extraordinarily subjective assessments. which I think is a fundamental problem with the notion, but I'll come back to the bigger problems with it as I conclude. So the bottom line I want to leave you with on this part before I go in kind of to the heart of my comments as to why this narrative is bad for America, which is really my argument. Let me just leave you with this thought, and that is that in any case, whether there are problems with the term or construct of sharp power or not, in any case, China is being represented as the most significant, powerful, and formidable wielder of sharp power in the world today. And disproportionately, according to our narrative, it's being directed at us. Though it is also, according to our narrative, being directed at many other countries, including Latin America as a whole, Australia, New Zealand, and a number of others that have been in the news. So China as wielder of sharp power, that is kind of where our coverage is right now. Now, I'll come back to sharp power in my concluding section, but let me turn to a few observations that I have about why I think a reflexive, ideologically driven negative narrative about China is bad for America. Because I think that's ultimately the acid test for me, coming from a U.S. perspective. I'm concerned about the negative narrative that we've seen, particularly because, as I mentioned, we are seeing it blossom at a time of very high performance on the part of the U.S. economy, as I noted earlier. It would be one thing if we were at 10.4% unemployment, as we were in early 2010, if the stock market were in the doldrums and so forth and so on, but that's not where we are. And generally, at least anecdotally in the past, I've perceived that there's been some level of hinging or correlation between some of those phenomena. We're out of that historical period now into a qualitatively different period, and that causes me some alarm. Here's why I think this rigid, reflexive, ideologically driven negative narrative about China, I've got to come up with an acronym for that at some point, is bad for our country. Now, let me share a few things with you here. Number one, I think that a number of journalists in this country, in their effort to make the story fit their preconceived narrative and to kind of, quote, give what they perceive, in their perception, give the people what they want, they're starting to get very sloppy with facts in a way that, for me personally, not being as expert as many of you on the media per se, although I have done some work in the media, I perceive there is a greater level of sloppiness around facts than I've seen before, at least with respect to China reporting. Let me give you two examples, because I actually believe that if you make an assertion, you ought to have factual evidence to be able to back up that assertion. That's my perspective on life. So let me give you a couple of examples just to make the point very clear. In the reporting about the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation that occurred in the fall of last year, one of the initial reports that kind of rang the alarm bell about CUSIF, the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, stated that CUSIF was a registered foreign agent, full stop, of China, a registered foreign agent. It's not. That's a factually, empirically, demonstrably false statement. What I mean by that is, if you look up the Foreign Agent Registration Act records, or FARA records, you'll see that CUSIF is a foreign principal. It is not a foreign agent. That's a matter of fact. That's not an opinion. It's not that way because I wish it to be. That's just what the form says in black and white. Now that's easy enough to find out, but the author didn't either seek to find it out, or when they became alerted to the fact, if they became alerted to the fact that that was an erroneous statement factually, they never bothered to change it. My theory is because the word agent sounds more menacing than the word principal. Because agent, of course, connotes secret agent, intelligence agent. It has a negative connotation. It's intended to have a negative connotation. Never mind that that's not what the FARA form says. Another article, different journalist, different publication, said that by virtue of being on the FARA list, CUSIF, quote, represents China. That statement is false. It is factually false. Just not true. FARA's website itself states that just the appearance on the FARA registration platform doesn't say anything about whether an entity represents a government or not. And in fact, a very, very, very large number of FARA registered entities are not governmental entities. So to say that by being registered on FARA you're the representative of a government is a factually false statement. Easy enough to look up, no one bothered to do it, or the individual in question didn't bother to do it. I could go through for 5 hours and give you a list of about 25 to 30 factual mistakes, but I wanted to give you two that are very clear-cut and documentable, just to show you that this is real, that there is I think, either an unwitting or a witting dynamic in which the facts are becoming less important, because what's important is I want to put forth a narrative, and if the facts countervail that or get in the way of that or are inconvenient, then I'm simply not going to cite them, or I will make up my own facts, quote unquote, thus entering into the domain of alternative facts, otherwise known as falsehoods. So this is a dynamic that we see. When you try to force a narrative to the detriment of facts, that's bad for this country. That's the argument that I'd make. The second point I would make, again, why is this bad for America, this negative narrative, is that it can get you into a vicious cycle and ultimately generate missed opportunities, in this case between the United States and China. If we start categorically stating that every single thing China does is nefarious in its intent, then you create a rhetorical climate in which obviously China is going to react and respond, and you end up in an escalation of rhetoric, and you ultimately can very easily, and often do, end up in an escalation of tit-for-tat actions. And bear in mind, this whole notion of a threatened trade war is playing out against the backdrop of this highly charged narrative. I don't think the two are entirely unrelated. And you can end up missing out on opportunities that would otherwise be available if governments were operating on the basis that there is some value in a constructive relationship, even if I'm dealing with a formidable competitor. So a vicious cycle of rhetoric and actions and missed opportunities that come from that is another concern I have. Very important factor, number 3, reciprocity. If we in this country start shutting out and shutting down in the way that has been called for, Chinese involvement, funding, foundation work, exchanges, Confucius Institutes, which we here at the University of Texas don't have, so it's an abstract issue to us, but it's a real issue for others. If we as a nation start saying we're going to shut all of this down, how long do you think it's going to be before China does the same thing to all of our cherished presences in China? They have Confucius Institutes. We have American centers. They have foundations that fund exchanges. So do we, MacArthur, Carnegie, Ford, and many, many others. They have public diplomacy that's aimed at informing and influence the opinion of our country. We have the same efforts relative to their country. When we start saying we're going to shut you out, does anyone think it's going to be very long before China starts doing the same thing to us? And secondly, when you shut someone out, you're also depriving yourself of the opportunity to influence them. So the notion of reciprocity and the notion of what could be coming down the pike in terms of retaliatory actions, or let's just put it this way, symmetrical actions on the part of China toward the Fulbright program, toward the Humphrey program, named for our former vice president, for the International Visitor Program, and all of the U.S. government funded and sponsored programs that are so precious and so valuable to this university and our nation and the bilateral relationship. Where do you think they go if we keep going down this road? I happen to know something about those programs because I administered them in my nearly 20-year career as a diplomat focusing on public diplomacy. So I haven't seen an article yet talk about that repercussion, but it's an obvious one and we have to think about it. That's why this type of narrative is a bad deal for our country, for our country. Number 4, we lose the moral high ground if we start talking about shutting all of these things down. We have always prided ourselves as a nation on our openness. We have always said, we welcome all ideas. We take all comers. We want to see the vigorous contestation of ideas. Our democracy is predicated on it. Our nation is predicated on it. And we've always said we welcome ideas even when we don't agree with them. The famous line, "I may not agree with what you say, but I would die for your right to say it." That's a part of our genetics as Americans. And if we start saying, well, we're going to shut out this foundation, we're going to shut out the Confucius Institutes, for example, for a very real-time example that's playing out in the media right now, how do we then complain to the Chinese when they shut us out? On exactly the same grounds. Any moral high ground we had, we don't have. And I was a diplomat in China and in Russia. I've seen the passage of those NGO laws. I know what the restrictions that our public diplomacy programming faces and bumps up against in those countries and some others as well. I know what it's like to hear someone say, we distrust your programs. You're trying to infiltrate our society. You're trying to unduly influence us, change our thinking. You're being hostile to us. I heard the Chinese say that. I heard the Russians say it. And guess what? I'm hearing the Americans say it today. And that alarms me. So the moral high ground, I think, is a really important issue. Another point, hypocrisy. For us to take China or any country to task for endeavoring to inform and influence public opinion in support of their foreign policy objectives, by the way, that is the definition of public diplomacy. That is the dictionary definition of public diplomacy. The effort to inform and influence foreign public opinion in support of your own country's foreign policy. For us to take issue with them leaves us open to them taking issue with us and makes us seem enormously hypocritical, because while we take issue with the Chinese, we absolutely presume, arrogantly, that no one could possibly take issue with our doing exactly the same thing through our own modalities. Let me read you one thing that I want to share that I think is really important for us to focus on when we talk about hypocrisy. In the National Endowment of Democracy, or NED, report that I mentioned earlier, entitled Sharp Power, that came out in December, there is a passage, and I want to read it to you in full, so bear with me. It is a passage that Senator Marco Rubio of Florida cited in full in a December 13th congressional hearing that he chaired for the Congressional Executive Committee on China. And he cited it in full, in a sense affiliating himself and associating himself with these statements. But the words come from the NED report. Let me quote the words. This is the NED report on China's application of sharp power, in particular, in this case, in Latin America. Here's what the report said. Here's what Senator Rubio repeated verbatim. Quote, Beijing's strategy clearly targets Latin American elites, prominent regional leaders from multiple fields, including politicians, academics, journalists, former diplomats, current government officials, and students, among others, are subtly being enticed by the Chinese government through personal interaction with the ultimate purpose of gaining their support for China. As a result, many of these renowned and influential people have already become de facto ambassadors of the Chinese cause. End quote. Now let me begin another quote. Again, from the report and that came through in the hearing. In China's people-to-people engagement, money is key. Free of charge trainings, exchange programs, and scholarships in China have proven to be effective tools to engage Latin America's regional elites, an idea supported in late 2016 by Xi Jinping's announcement that China will train 10,000 Latin Americans by 2020. The media and academia are two areas of priority attention for Beijing's efforts. Consequently, China is determined to promote cooperation of different kinds between media companies, universities, and think tanks, both at the regional and country level. Education and culture are increasingly important in Beijing's toolkit as well. End quote. The two paragraphs I just quoted would be a surgically exact and precise description of U.S. public diplomacy around the world. You could take every single word and substitute America for China and American for Chinese, and it would be exactly what the United States does every day in every country on the earth with whom we have diplomatic relations. Now, we are lambasting China for doing this, but we're doing all of those things, and we should be. And so should every country. Every country has the right to make its views known, to seek to influence foreign publics. If they don't have the right, then we're not long going to have the right after we take that right from them. If we shut them down, we will be shut down. There's always the issue of reciprocity. But here, for us to be critical of a nation that is trying, admittedly, yes, to influence our discourse, while not recognizing that we're trying to do the exact darn same thing to them, I think is an act of hypocrisy. And I think it makes us less credible as a nation. That's why I think it's bad for our nation to go down this road. So that's the issue of hypocrisy. Two final points on this, and I'll shift over to my concluding thoughts. I think one of the things that alarms me most about what we're seeing in American coverage of China and American discourse and narratives about China in this country is a very unseemly sense of weakness on the part of ourselves, angst, lack of confidence, and a sense of vulnerability. If you look at the December 13th hearing, if you look at the letters that people have written calling for the closure of Confucius Institutes, et cetera, what we're hearing, if you look at the articles where journalists breathlessly talk about the need to, quote, expose China, their word, that particular journalist's word, to me that sounds like fear. Sounds like lack of confidence. It sounds like we don't think we can win the contestation of ideas with this authoritarian single-party state. I have a problem with that for two reasons. Number one, I don't feel a sense of weakness about our system. I don't feel any sense of weakness about our extraordinary Constitution. I don't feel any sense of weakness or vulnerability about the resiliency of this nation and our people. And I think it's wrong to convey that sense of weakness and vulnerability. But perhaps more to the point, I think it's dangerous to convey weakness to a formidable competitor. Even if you feel it, you generally don't want to telegraph it to the most formidable competitor you have now or ever will for the lifetimes of every person in this room. You wouldn't want to show that weakness because it might embolden your formidable competitor to do things that they might not do if you were projecting an image of strength. So I have a real problem with the weakness that this seems to be belying, or the sense of weakness and vulnerability that we seem to be conveying, and being so alarmed about, quote, China's influence operations. And let me make one other point and apply it to a university campus. When anyone talks about shutting down Confucius Institutes, and again, I don't, and we as a university don't have a dog in this hunt because we don't have a Confucius Institute, so let me speak about this from a distance. But when anyone talks about shutting down Confucius Institutes because they represent a threat to our national security, and because they are deemed, according to the letter which I have here that was in the news recently, to be instruments of propagandizing students and so forth and so on, then what you're really saying is that American students are just too darn dumb to know what they're hearing, to be able to judge the veracity, accuracy, and credibility of what they're hearing, to be able to assess sources, as all of us are trained in academia to do, that we have to protect these poor kids because, by golly, they're too darn dumb and too weak to be able to understand what they're hearing from some professor that might come and speak under the auspices of a Confucius Institute. In my book, that's pretty insulting, because I happen to think very highly of the students of the great state of Texas, and this university above all. And you know it, and I know it. We have tremendous caliber students at this school, students that are well equipped, thanks to the extraordinary leadership and professors here, to be able to discern what's real and what's not real. To imply otherwise is not only betraying a sense that we're weak, it's an insult. And I think it's something that I have a problem with intellectually. The final point that I would make before concluding, as to the kind of last reason I would offer as to why this type of, again, reflexive, ideologically driven negative narrative is bad for our country, is because I think it starts to sour the next generations of would-be China scholars and China-focused policymakers and leaders and professors and so on the relationship with China and on China. And it could end up potentially causing folks that say, hey, I'm interested in China, but I don't want to deal in my entire career with this kind of negativity and nastiness and viciousness, so maybe I'll do something else and work on Norway affairs, because you're not going to see these stories about Norway or Paraguay or whatever country in the world you might pick. Well, that notion of souring that next generation of leaders, represented well right here in this room, to me that's very problematic, and that's something we need to think about as a second and third order effect of this negative narrative. For all of these reasons, I think a negative narrative of the type that we're seeing now, mostly generated by the media, with some of the flames fanned by some political figures as well, of both parties, I think it's bad for our country for all the reasons I've just mentioned. And I think we need to be very careful before we go down that road. Now let me offer a few final concluding thoughts. Number one, we need to be cognizant not only of China's actions in terms of its public diplomacy efforts here in the United States, what some call its influence operations, etc., but also, and yes, we should be cognizant of those things, no question. We should be aware of them. We should understand them. But we also have to be aware of what a reflexive, ideologically driven negative narrative can mean in terms of its corrosive effect on our own country, on our own values, and on our own institutions. To my mind, it's the second thing that is the greater threat to the United States than the first. So I think we have to think about that very carefully before we go down the road that seems to be out there potentially before us. Let me make a couple of other quick points. Number one, in terms of takeaways, if you will, at a kind of a conclusion level, the fact that there is now a language that has been created specifically to describe China's activities, to me is emblematic of a pretty serious phenomenon and a pretty concerning phenomenon that we can't even find words within our existing lexicon up until December to describe just how evil China is. We therefore have to make up new words. So let me say a little bit about that. And this goes back to the notion of sharp power. What we call, when we talk about China, influence operations, we call public diplomacy when we talk about the United States. What we refer to as sharp power when exercised by China, we refer to as soft power when exactly the same thing is exercised by the United States of America. What we call agents And I use the word advisedly because that's the word that is used. When we talk about China, we call partners when we talk about America. This is where we are in our narrative about China in this country today. We have created an entirely new lexicon to connote just how profound this threat is in the minds of those that are putting this language on the table. To summarize my point here, I would say that a good working definition of sharp power is soft power exercised by someone you don't like. That is what sharp power is. And when you look at the definition that I talked about in some detail earlier, it's hard to argue it because there is not all that objective and fact-based a definition. It is a highly subjective term, so I will stick with my interpretation. Sharp power is soft power utilized by someone you don't like. And that's what we're talking about. Now, the second point that I want to make is that on the issue of Chinese influence in the United States. Is China trying to influence U.S. discourse? Absolutely, yes, of course. Emphatically, China is trying to influence U.S. discourse. There's no question about that. Are they getting better at it than they've ever been before? Emphatically, yes. They're getting much, much better at it than they've ever been before. For those who remember China's public diplomacy efforts in the 1980s, let's say, they were pretty ham-fisted and unsophisticated because China had not been the type of country that had been engaged in the world on the strength of soft power, on the strength of selling an allure or attraction to your values, etc. That's the soft power game. And it took China a while to get to the point where they could become a more sophisticated executor of soft power. But they got very, very good at it. They got so good at it that now it's alarming a lot of people that haven't been used to China being as sophisticated in communicating with the American public as they have come to be. So yes, they're getting better at it every single day. But here's the thing that I would say. Everything virtually that China does directed at the United States and at our discourse, we do toward China. Every single thing. We have exchanges. We have speakers. We have an international visitor program. We have American corners. We teach English as a nation. We have officials who are English language teaching officers who work to promulgate the learning of the English language, the exact analog of what a Confucius Institute is about. We have speakers talking about our culture. And let me go one step further. The fact is, if we're really being honest, the United States, and I'll just be very candid and honest here, if the United States could script it, China would be a democracy. Let's just be honest about it. It's the truth. That's what our goal is. It may not be the specific thing that we're acting upon on a daily basis, but if you were to strip away the niceties, the United States would be more comfortable with a China that is a democracy. We'd love to see a different type of regime in China. That's the truth. It's stated very clearly in all of our public diplomacy documents that are unclassified and on the record. And every president of both parties talks in those terms. Interestingly enough, China does not seek to make the United States a communist party autocracy like it is. It doesn't seek to do that. So if there's anyone seeking to change the nature of the regime, in my judgment, having been on the front lines of U.S. public diplomacy very proudly for my nation, it's the United States, not China. And let me add one humorous but perhaps rather serious point. Why doesn't China want us, and I'll say this a little bit cynically and provocatively here, why might China not want, indeed, to change our regime type into a communist autocracy as they are? Because, again, being a little provocative, they're pretty happy with the level of inefficiency and ineffectiveness of our system. As a competitor to the United States, they like what they see in our system. Why would they want us to have the ability to build a building in 30 days, when in our system it takes 30 years. So from a competitive standpoint, it seems very logical to me that China is very content with the U.S. having the system that we have. So this notion that China is seeking to influence us, yes, they are. We're seeking to influence them. All nations conduct some level or another of public diplomacy activities. Activities designed to inform and influence the public opinion of a foreign country in support of your foreign policy objectives. They do it, we do it, often with the very same tools. It's hypocritical for us to be critical of others when they do it, when it is at the heart and soul of our own diplomatic effort. And moreover, when our own aspirations relative to other countries are far more expansive than their aspirations are relative to us by any objective measure. Let me make one final point before just offering my last lines here, and that is on the issue of asymmetry. There is no question that China, being an authoritarian one-party state, and indeed being a self-described dictatorship, China in its constitution, Article 1 of China's constitution, states China is a dictatorship. It refers to itself as a people's democratic dictatorship, but the noun is dictatorship. Now, we are a democracy, a republic, if you will. There is an asymmetry in our systems. There is an asymmetry, a structural asymmetry and permanent asymmetry in our media environments. China's media is censored and controlled by the party. Our media is free, and to the extent it's controlled by the corporations that fund the message. But it is free, and there is a contestation of ideas here that does not exist in China. Now, that asymmetry does exist. It is true that China, because of our wonderful and sacred openness as a nation, and constitutionally protected openness as a nation, China does have more access to the airwaves here than we as a nation do in China. There's no question about that. Is that fair? No, not really, but the two systems are different. Now here's my point. There's some that would say, well, this asymmetry between the United States and China means it's obviously an unlevel playing field, which it is, and therefore we should take steps to level the playing field. But since we're not going to be able to level the playing field in the People's Republic of China because we don't control what happens in the People's Republic of China, the only way you can level the playing field is by ramping up a level of control here that we've never had, and excluding voices because of the content of their opinions in a way that our First Amendment doesn't allow. And you start to go down a very dangerous road as you do that. So there is an asymmetry, but let me make this final point about it. There was an asymmetry between the United States and the Soviet Union, too. It didn't stop the power of the American idea from triumphing in the Cold War. And it shouldn't stop the power of idea from having the appeal that it ought to rightly have in a contestation of ideas, even where there is an asymmetrical landscape on which we're operating. We operated on it in the Cold War. We did pretty well. We can deal with an asymmetric scenario with China. So with that, let me just offer my final thoughts and stop here. We need to be in, we need to participate in, and we need to win the contestation of ideas. That's what we do. That is the mission statement of the United States as a nation, among nations. Our only recourse is to engage and seek to win that contest on the merits over some period of time. Just as we did, as we look back at the Cold War, we won the contestation of ideas. We can win. We ought to be confident in our Constitution. We ought to be confident in our First Amendment. We ought to be confident in our openness and our transparency. We ought to be confident enough to have people come to our universities and say things that we might not agree with, but trust our students and our faculty enough to know that they'll have the ability to make those judgments for themselves. Thank you. but it's got to be rooted in confidence. Second, we shouldn't be afraid or convey that we're afraid of that contestation of ideas because, frankly, in my book, that's un-American. This is what we do. And to be afraid, or even worse, to convey that you're afraid of losing to an authoritarian regime, that we can't win that contestation of ideas, I don't buy that. Number three, we have to be cognizant of the influence game and how it has changed in the age of social media. And that includes China's activities and includes everyone else's as well. And for that matter, includes the internal things that are happening in this country that aren't about China or Russia or others. But in my judgment, we should not hunker down, shut down, or disengage, because doing so would be inimical to our own interests and, frankly, contrary to our values. So China is a tremendously formidable competitor of the United States. There's no question about it. We need to up our game as a nation as we compete peacefully with this formidable rival and competitor. But we also need to be fact-based, clear-eyed, textured, and nuanced in our understanding of China and in its motivations and intentions, and ultimately in our narrative, just as we need to be confident in the values and the principles of our nation that have served us so well for so long. I hope that, for my part, I and perhaps many of us or all of us can be voices for that fact-based, textured narrative that will allow our nations to engage the way we need to succeed as we go forward. We have to get this bilateral relationship right, because the implications and consequences of getting it wrong are far-reaching and not very pleasant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And on this note, on American confidence, let's open the floor to questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your comments. I've been wondering what to make of some of these developments. There's obviously, I'm in the School of Journalism, by the way, so I've been wondering with regard to the foundation funding controversy that happened. I know you're a diplomat by training, so you may not want to answer this, but I guess I was a little surprised I think most of us in this room would be sympathetic to what you've said and the goals that you laid out. I certainly am, but I guess I was a little surprised at why our university leadership was so quick to knuckle under to some of these charges by Rubio. And others, I wondered how widespread that view is. There's a lot of things being said that I don't agree with in the media these days, but I wondered how widespread that view was, and on a campus like this.
That view, you mean?
Meaning to not accept any funding from China for any program on this campus, given how many donors there are in every school in this campus with their own interest and concerns about funding things. Why were we so quick to cast off that relationship?
Well, let me just say a couple of things. There's one person at the University of Texas, Austin, who can speak authoritatively for the university, and that's the president of the University of Texas, Austin. He sets policy for the university, and as a university employee, I support the president. There were a lot of different views around these different issues. There was, I think, a fair hearing of the different arguments in all directions. And ultimately, President Finvez made the decision that it was his prerogative to make as president. And he clearly was best equipped as president of the university to look at the matter through the lens of the university per se. And I certainly respect that. I think to your question about the sort of how widespread the sentiment was or is on campus that would sort of push away this type of opportunity. Anecdotally, my impression is that most people who I talk to, most people who I deal with in my capacity as the executive director of the China Public Policy Center, want to engage China. They feel the need to engage China because China is the second biggest economy in the world. It's in the top 3 for both exports and imports for Texas specifically. It's enormously important to our nation, to our state. We have a lot of work that we can and should do that would be very fruitful and mutually beneficial. And the overall sentiment that I perceive and feel in the work that I do as the founding executive director of the China Public Policy Center is that this university, and by the way, including President Fenves, whose visionary leadership made it possible to create this center, and who believed in the idea that I'm articulating, we all want to engage China. I think there are some differences of opinion within this faculty and within the UT community as to the modalities for how to do that. I think some of those differences were brought to the surface and aired out, and ultimately a decision was made, and that's how the system's supposed to work. And I think, there are any number of ways to engage, there are any number of ways to fuel that engagement, and I feel very confident that there are a lot of great things in front of us and a lot of great resources in front of us for us to be able to execute the university's vision, the president's vision, Dean Evans' vision, my vision, and the vision of the university to be a significant player in the China field. And I think I'm very bullish about where we're going.
It's just coincidental because we got some money from the foundation to send some of our students to China back in December, and I was very happy to get it and send them.
And I briefed those students before I was asked to brief those students before they left. A great group of folks. I'm still in touch with one of the folks who reached out to me afterwards. And where I come from, leaving aside funding sources, I am in the camp of more exchanges are good. That's just where I am. And I also am of the point of view that our students are exceptional. Just as those students who I had the privilege to brief before they went to China were, I think, an extraordinary group of students who were terrific ambassadors for our university, and I know there were other universities represented. But bottom line is, I think students have the ability to take in information, look at sources, look at things, hear what the other side thinks, express what they think. I think the more of that can go on between the United States and China, the better. The more understanding there is, the better. The more trust we can build at the human and people-to-people level, the better. And so I philosophically just tend to be of the view, however we can make that happen within the comfort level of this university and the laws and policies of our state and so forth, and I believe more is better. Yes, sir.
Okay, so 2 questions. And one of them requires a little bit of a predicate, because I've worked on Brazil for 40 years, but I went there as a USIA officer back in 1976.
Oh.
And so it gave me a little bit of an observation on public diplomacy. And one thing I noticed was that people were engaging us in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, they paid attention to us at one level because the US is a big economic power. And I think a lot of what's going on with China is that. There's a pragmatic need to understand a large power in the world, and so people engage heavily for that. But when you look at the actual contestation of ideas, I knew people who went, for instance, to Patrice Lumumba University to get an engineering degree because they gave them a scholarship.
Right. And
they came back as a qualified engineer. But at the level of ideas, the big rival of the US at that point was France, in terms of what's the intellectual, particularly in the Brazilian higher education system, or probably still is, the big rival. And so I think it's interesting when we start talking about Chinese influence, we have to sort of pick it apart a little bit. Because I suspect what's going on now in Latin America is a lot of people are saying, yeah, big power, economically, we have to engage it, we have to understand it, and maybe learning Chinese is a good idea, maybe even studying in China is a good idea. But that is quite different than kind of a high level, what do we want our system to look like, sort of debate. And so just for kind of thinking about clarifying this thing a bit, I think one interesting thing is to think about how people are engaging China, in part because of its its economic heft versus how they're engaging at the level of exchange of ideas. Because I just saw those two things as very different in how they played out. And public diplomacy was playing into both. I mean, one of our pushes was, hey, look how good we are in technology. Look how big our economy is, et cetera, et cetera. But then that was all very interesting and useful. But the more subtle, what would we like our system to turn out to be, was a whole other level of debate. In fact, I was there specifically to push human rights, and that was a whole different level of dialogue.
Definitely.
And so I wonder, so the first question is how you see that playing out. If you sort of tease China's influence apart, and its influence operations or public diplomacy apart, how they see that, if they have kind of something similar to that, or just kind of, or how we maybe want to respond to it. Like, China's asserting this, how do we respond to that? Second, well, I read the NED report, and I actually had the impression that sharp power might apply pretty well to Russia's approach to the US, but that it was real false equivalency to compare it and China.
Yeah.
So I don't know, whichever order you want to go in on those.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the comments and the questions as well. Let me take the second one first because I think it's shorter and more and
Yeah, the other one's too long, sorry.
No, but it's a pretty profound point. I want to touch on that at least as well. But in terms of the second point, I do think that we're talking about I agree with you. I think we're talking about a qualitatively different type of involvement in American discourse. And the red line that is at issue is that what Russia is widely believed and certainly alleged to have done, and certainly the entire U.S. intelligence community, most of the U.S. political establishment across partisan lines agrees that Russia did it. Not everyone agrees, but most do. What they're alleged to have done is to have violated federal law in certain very specific ways. Now, no one in any of the reporting that we've seen in the media in which journalists and also now political figures are alleging that China is a threat to the U.S. national security interest and so on, that we must, quote, expose China and so on. I've read all the articles. Not a single one of them has alleged any criminal wrongdoing on the part of China. No one is alleging that China has violated any law. No one is alleging that China tried to infiltrate our electoral process, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, all of that discussion, of course, is about Russia. So I do think that to paint Russia and China with the same brush, given that no one has alleged criminal wrongdoing or violation of federal law on the part of China, is inappropriate in the sense that you're mixing an apple with an orange, the apple being felony wrongdoing potentially, and the orange being the natural exercise of national influence as a matter of public diplomacy, which you understand from your time at USIA, and I do, and others that have been in that world as well. So in short, I agree with you, and I think that there is a problem in lumping those two together because the techniques and the modalities employed are actually quite different. So that's the first point that I would make. Now, let me also make one other point that goes to that, because it's really interesting. There was a letter sent by a couple of members of Congress, which we talked about earlier, calling upon Texas universities to cease and desist with Confucius Institutes. One thing striking about the San Antonio Express News article that reported on this, just as there were Austin American Statesman, Dallas Morning News, and others, the San Antonio Express News article was quite remarkable in a positive sense because it seemed to go one step further than any of the other articles that I've ever seen on that topic or any of the other related topics. Evidently, it occurred to the journalist to call up the congressional offices and ask what the evidence was for the assessment that the Confucius Institutes constitute a threat to national security. And here, let me quote the article. The communications director, I'm quoting, quote, the communications director from McCall acknowledged that he and Cuellar have no examples or specific evidence that the Institute at UTSA or any other Texas university was generating propaganda or pushing China's interests. No examples or specific evidence that any of this was being done. So a lot of what's happening in the discourse, and by the way, I commend the spokesperson for being honest and for saying we have zero evidentiary basis for doing any of this, but we're still doing it. And I not facetiously commend the honesty of the individual for acknowledging that. And I commend the reporter for thinking to ask that question, because guess what, my friends in the wonderful Moody College of Communication, no other journalist asked that question in the last 6 months, or if they did, not one of them reported the answer. Because the answer to that question would have been the same in almost every case of every article that came out. So kudos to the reporter, kudos to the representative staff for being honest. But my point is this, it goes right back to what you said. In one case, you're dealing with a case in which there is ample evidentiary basis for the judgments and the allegations that are made. In another case, you're dealing with an instance in which there is no evidentiary basis for the allegations. And briefly on your other point, before going over to your question, on the issue of sort of teasing apart, it's a big topic and maybe we can discuss it more offline, but teasing apart what China's trying to do. Bottom line, there's no question that China is seeking to shift the terms of U.S. discourse onto terms more favorable to China. Yes, that's what China's trying to do. For those of us that have worked in the public diplomacy world, as you have and as I have for a couple of decades, that is not a surprising thing. That's what countries do. That's what we do. That's what they do. And in my judgment, and it may sound provocative or sound controversial, but my judgment is if a nation is operating within the laws, the Constitution and the laws of our nation, then let the ideas compete, because quite frankly, there is no way to shut down communication based on content if it's not in violation of the law, and it generally isn't because of this little thing we've got called the First Amendment. So let the ideas, as they say in Chinese, let the 100 schools, the 100 flowers bloom, and let the 100 ideas contend. And so I just think that China is trying to influence our discourse. They're getting pretty good at it. We have to acclimate ourselves to that, and we have to up our national game by being worthy of our values and our constitutional principles rather than hunkering down and shutting off everything that made us great in the first place. Yes, ma'am, then yes, sir.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I agree with the basic line, the point that engagement is very important, and more understanding actually is more helpful for us to really see each other, especially for college students. I teach Intro to China at UT, and I probably is the very only one, if I would say, on campus that who wants UT students to have strong interest in China. But I'm a bit surprised that you didn't mention anything about this nuanced play that Chinese government imposed in American universities, all this, the censorship going on, not just within China. I mean, if you look at the human rights reports in the past few years, since Xi Jinping took power, human rights situation is so much worse every year. Control is tighter and tighter, lawyers were arrested, and their family were under house arrest. And what it made even worse is that this kind of approach actually is coming out of China. That's why Confucius Institute is being questioned in America. So there are many different kinds of fundings in American universities, such as CCK Foundation, which is very friendly and very welcoming to those independent scholarship. So I wonder, you mentioned that your definition of soft power, sharp power is soft power utilized by someone if you don't like. I think, when we talk about soft power, usually we think about NBA in America, in the basketball game in China. People loves it, or Japanese manga, or even yoga from India. All these they were actually originated and promoted really in society, not really promoted by government with this heavily ideological investment. But in the China case, it's very different. So Confucius Institute use those textbooks and have those talks and censor scholars scholarship. So I wonder, my point is we all agree that we should have more engagement, more collaboration, but how to do it, how to really protect the core values of American society, which is open, freedom of speeches, freedom of expressions, instead of being influenced by party ideology from China.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate that perspective, and you've raised a number of different issues. About 100 universities in the United States, all across the country, public and private, top tier, mid tier, etc., have Confucius Institutes today. In those instances, presumably the boards of regents, the presidents, and the other leaders that made the decisions to authorize the creation or the launch of a Confucius Institute on their campuses, they evidently judged that looking at the pros, looking at the cons, the pros outweighed the cons, and that's why apparently they made the decision that they made. If at any point those universities feel that editorial independence, scholarly integrity, or other values are compromised, then those universities would be well within their rights to shut down the Confucius Institutes. But the basic argument that you're making is an argument that is shared by some, but it's an argument and a belief that is not shared by many boards of regents, many university presidents, many university vice presidents and provosts. So it's an opinion, it's a judgment call, and there is not unanimity in this country around it, but there are a lot of organizations that have felt that net, on the aggregate, the exposure to the language, the money for language learning, the cultures and the cultural content, that there's value in that. Do they understand that the institutes, and again, since we don't have one here, I'm not speaking from personal experience, but do those folks that are managing these programs at these universities understand that this is funded by China? Yes, of course they do. So are American Corners in China. So are American Fulbright Scholars in China, and the list goes on. Do they understand that? Yes. Do they recognize that these institutes are not going to do huge programs on human rights or the Dalai Lama or Taiwan independence or any of the other sensitive issues? Of course. But there's plenty of room on those same campuses to do all of those things. So I'm guessing that the judgment that these other folks have made is that on the aggregate there's positive value to the exchange, and there's positive value to knowing what some of those views are. And if you have a different view, that's wonderful. But to talk about openness and to talk about wanting ideas to be contested and to talk about wanting academic freedom, and then in the next breath say, but we're going to shut down these organizations because they represent a view that we don't like, is, I think, internally inherently contradictory. And it's not what universities philosophically, I think, are about. But each individual university, I think, is well within its rights to make those judgments for themselves, and they are. And some folks, I think, that get letters from members of Congress who are concerned, opt to close the Confucius Institutes. Others opt not to close the Confucius Institutes. And I think in this country, the beauty of our system is that we don't have centralized power, and we don't have central authorities telling people what to do, but that universities, their leaderships, their boards can make those decisions very capably for themselves. And yes, there's a lot of other institutions and funders that are out there, and I think that there's a wealth of opportunity for supporting the kind of work that I think can increase understanding. And I think that every case should be looked at on the merits, and I think that every case should be looked at in a fact-based and evidence-based way, so that when a decision is made one way or the other, that it's made with knowledge of the facts, and that it's made based on the facts, rather than based on a reflexive, ideologically driven narrative that may not be factually based. And that's one of the elements of the phenomenon I think we've seen in this country.
You have been saying that this narrative in America is ideologically driven, but I wonder what kind of ideology that is. because you use this McCarthy in your summary, in your introduction of the talk. I was very surprised to see that term because everyone in America understands the extreme connotation of McCarthyism and that era. And you use that word, and also you basically in your talk just now, you keep saying this ideologically driven narrative that have been prevailing in American media. I wonder what kind of ideology do you refer to here in your context?
The ideology is an ideology that believes, and it can cross partisan lines, although I think it's disproportionately on one side of the partisan aisle, but not exclusively. The ideology that China is coming to get us, they are gunning for us, and that they are going to bury us. That is the ideology to which I'm referring. All you have to do is look at the letters to see the language. Don't listen to my words. Look at the letters that members of Congress have written. Look at the congressional record and the testimony that's on the record, and hear the proponents of this ideology articulate it for themselves. That's exactly what they've said. That's what's in the letter.
Sorry, I can't help. If we turn around the argument, can we say that it's because we feel that our freedom of expressions are being threatened? That's why we have to all rise up to fight against this infiltration.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why you see this widespread of writings in newspapers on
but the
American, not just American media.
But the
also all
countervailing
the
evidence
world.
is that clearly not everybody feels that way, because if they did, there wouldn't be 100 Confucius Institutes still operating in the
That
United
happened
States.
at the beginning of 2000, during which the whole political environment in China was very different from now. If you work in China, you should know that since Xi Jinping took power, the whole situation changed fundamentally.
Right.
So if we really take the historical perspective, then it looks very different now compared to 5 years ago. Right? So we didn't see this kind of backlash in America and other Western countries 5 years ago,
Right.
but it appears now. So we should ask ourselves, why now?
Well,
and why on such large scale?
Well, a couple of things. One, I want to give other folks a chance to talk, and we can talk offline, Iris, if you'd like
Thank
to
you
do
so
that.
much. I really
But
appreciate
let me
it.
also just say, as I said at the beginning, there is a very different context. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, I think the fact that this is happening it really started very closely on the heels of the 19th Party Congress. There is a sense that China is more powerful, that this president, the leader of China, Xi Jinping, is more powerful, that China's aspirations are different than they were, that they're somewhat more expansive than they were. All of those things, as I said at the outset of my presentation, are funneling in to a perception on the part of some that there is a greater sense of threat associated with this country than there has been perceived to be before. I don't think the nature of the regime has changed at all. The nature of the regime is what it is. It's what it's always been. It's the new and improved or whatever. You mentioned human rights reports. I've written significant swaths of numerous U.S. State Department human rights reports. I know what's in those reports because I put a lot of the content in those reports. So I understand very well the dynamics that you're talking about. And as I said, the overall context in which this narrative is playing out is a part of the mix. The other part of that context, as I noted, is the issue of alternative facts, moving away from evidence-based argumentation, and so forth and so on. And there's a whole constellation of factors that's in there. But the point being, different people view this issue different ways. Universities view it differently. Universities and think tanks view the issue of funding, of Confucius Institutes, et cetera, in very different ways. And that's one of the great things about this country, is that it's a pluralistic society where individuals who are competent to make those decisions can make them for themselves on the basis of the merits and on the basis of evidence.